all the way along here, we've been talking about the Celts, the Celtic this and the Celtic that, the Scottish Celts, the Irish Celts, etc. So what in the world were the Celts? Let's talk about that for a few minutes. The Celts were a group of people that were not all like one tribe. The thing that they shared in common were their language, which turned into what we came to know as Gaelic or Gallic. If you're in Scotland, they do pronounce it differently. In Ireland, it's pronounced Gaelic. In Scotland, it's pronounced Gallic. But originally, the Celtic peoples were primarily in the middle part of Europe. There were some over in Asia Minor, what we know of as Turkey today, and they spread. This yellow area along the Rhine River system was where they were most concentrated. They spread down into the Iberian Peninsula, but then during the period, and we know about them from almost 1000 AD up until about 800, almost 1000 BC to 450 BC is when they were in Europe. What happened was, as the Roman Empire grew, and as you have the barbarian migrations, the barbarians began to move, Huns and Visigoths and Ostrogoths, and when Rome was finally overthrown in the 5th century AD, both the Romans and then the barbarians were pushing everybody further and further west. And eventually the Gallic people, the Celts, got pushed to first Britain, and then when the Anglo-Saxons came in, they got pushed to the western edge of Britain, so that they were in Scotland, which was pretty much too rough for the Romans or anybody else to get up there, into Wales, into Cornwall, which is the southwestern tip here of Britain, into Ireland, and then because of some of the struggles with the Anglo-Saxons and others, many of them then came back down into Europe to the area of Brittany, which is now in France, and even to the northwestern corner of Spain, the area there called Galicia. And Galicia, Gallic or Gaelic, we came up that way from Lisbon and we stopped in Galicia, and it was fascinating. They have bagpipes in Spain. There's very much a strong Celtic influence there as well. So the Celts got pushed further and further west until they ended up being primarily Scotland, Ireland, Wales, Cornwall, and then a little bit down in Brittany and Galicia in Spain. There are two large groupings of the Celts. They're considered in terms of the Gaels, that is the Irish, the Scottish, and the Manx, those in the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is very strongly Celtic, and you're going to discover that in a matter of just a few days, because we'll be stopping at the Isle of Man, and I'm going to mention that again when we talk about the Druids. So you've got Irish, Scottish, and Manx were considered the Gaels, and then the Celtic Britons were those that were Welsh, Cornish, and Breton, B-R-E-T-O-N is what they call the Celts in Brittany in France. So very strong influence in there, and we'll talk a little bit about the arts of the Celts later on when we talk about Ireland and how the Irish saved civilization and Irish history. But right now I want to talk about I mentioned that the language was the thing that tied the Celtic peoples together. In fact, if you look at ancient history, at anthropology, sociology, when they talk about people groups, they don't usually talk about genetic similarities. They're not talking about people who have the same, even racial distinction, as much as they do the languages they speak. Because people are historically broken up into language groups. And so here we're talking about the Celtic languages. Most of us come from a background called PIE, which is Proto-Indo-European. It came out of Asia, and it developed not only the Indian languages, but most of the languages of Europe that we're familiar with. So these language groups were one of the things, the language group that tied the Celts together, but the other thing that tied them together was that they apparently had a very consistent religion, as spread out as they were. And that religion was significantly tied to the ancient Druids. From the time of Julius Caesar, of Cicero, or Cicero, if you're used to pronouncing it that way, Tacitus, Pliny the Elder, we have reports of various of these sort of magico-religious leaders of the Celtic people in both Gaul, what we think of as France today, and in Britain, that were called the Druids. It appears that they were a primary unifying factor amongst all the Celtic people. They all shared these Druids as their religious leaders. The word Druid comes from a Celtic word which means to know the oaks. The oak tree was considered holy to the Druids. Most of their ceremonies were held in clearings in the middle of forests. Oak trees were very important to them, and for that reason, mistletoe was considered sacred because it grows in oak trees. It's a parasite that grows in oak trees. And so the Celts had this group of people, the Druids, and they were the learned people. They say it took about 20 years for someone to be fully initiated into being a Druid. They were responsible for the worship, that is the divine worship, and they had a fairly complex polytheistic religion. They had over 400 named gods. They also, the Druids were also responsible for the performance of sacrifice, for divination, telling the future, for teaching and acting as judges. They adjudicated conflicts in the Celtic people. And the punishment that they had for people is if someone committed a crime, they could be outcast from the religious ceremony and therefore become an outcast in the society. Some people identified them as sort of wizards and soothsayers, but it's probably the most accurate way for us to understand them would be like a tribal shaman that was responsible for medical, for future telling, for spiritual leadership, and all those kinds of things. They particularly, as I say, in addition to oak trees and forests, trees in general, but especially oak trees, they held water and islands as being especially sacred. The Isle of Man, again, where you're going to be, the whole Isle of Man was considered an especially sacred place to the Druids. Now, we have no written records about the Druids. There's two kinds of history. There is written history, and when we talk about prehistory, that means before anything got written down. And then there's archaeological evidence. Those two things, written and archaeological materials, are the ways we know about the past. And we have no written records of the Druids because part of their religion said they didn't write things down. So when people today talk as though, I've actually known at least one person who said they were a Druid, and others talk about being Druids. And there's a modern Druid movement that I'm going to mention in a few minutes. We know very little by comparison to other ancient religions or other ancient peoples about what they actually believe. Most of what people think they know about the Druids is based upon 18th century misperceptions. The 18th century folks were really good about making up all these stories and presenting them as though they were actually fact, and we don't know that much about it. As one historian has said about the Druids and about some of Celtic culture anyway, we can know virtually nothing about them except that they existed. We've got enough evidence to know that they were there, but we don't know a whole lot about what they did or what they believed. The little we do know is that they believed very strongly in transmigration of the soul, which is the fancy theological way of saying reincarnation. They believed that when you died, it was not the absolute end, that you would be reborn as another person, or perhaps as a lower level of animal. As a friend of mine once said, he finally had figured out what reincarnation was all about. That if you die and you're bad, you come back as a beetle. If you're good, you come back as a person. If you're really, really good, you don't have to come back at all. Well, that's a pretty good definition of the transmigration of the soul. And so they believed that when a person died, it was not the end. The Latin poet Lucan described their belief as saying that they believed that that death was simply a pause in the longer life. And it's because of that they had seemingly a fairly easygoing relationship with death. They didn't have a lot of problems with it. We also know that they were very nature-based. They focused a lot on the cycles of the sun and the moon, and obviously with trees and water and islands being part of their sacred beliefs. The most important holiday for them was the summer solstice. And we do have an indication that they apparently were in three different classes within the Druids. One is the Bards. The Bards were responsible for history and poetry. In other words, they were supposed to remember the things that were important. The second group were called the Ovates. They were the shamans or mediums. They dealt with the supernatural events. And the third group were the priests. They were responsible for the ritual activities. So Bards, Ovates, and priests were the three categories or classes of these Druids. The Druids early on very strongly opposed the coming of Christianity, which obviously became the dominant religion, but they didn't die out completely as a people. Their religious practice did, but because they had so much focus on history and poetry and to be judges, adjudicating justice, that part of their belief system was maintained, and it continued in Britain. By the way, the reason I'm sitting down is not because I need to sit down, but if I'm standing up here doing this, you're all going to get seasick. So just in case you're wondering why I'm sitting down right now. One of the controversial things, and some modern people who sort of side with the Druids or even profess to be Druids don't like this, but according to Roman historians as well as Welsh and Irish legends, so Celtic legend, the Celtic Druids practiced human sacrifice. Remember I said that because they believed in reincarnation, death was not the final end, so they did not have as dramatic a fear or as much of a problem with death as most of us in the Western culture do. They had three major gods that we know of that demanded human sacrifice. One of them was called Tutates, the god of the people. He required sacrifice of people by drowning in sacred pools or wells. A second major god was Asus. Asus required victims who had been stabbed or hung. And then the third god that demanded sacrifice to the Druids and Celts was Tyrannus, the god of thunder, lightning, and the sun. And he required that his victims be burned to death. Great gods, huh? Here you see illustrations. As I say, there is some controversy about this, because even though the earliest traditions and the earliest reporting we have, Julius Caesar, for instance, was in Britain. He was in Gaul and Britain in the 1st century AD during his Gallic Wars, and he wrote about all this in his History of the Gallic Wars. He talked about the human sacrifice. There is some belief that, especially in sacrifice to the god Tyrannus, the god of thunder, that they would build, and that's what this image here is on the left, that they would take branches and weave together a large figure in the shape of a man. It was called a Wicker Man. They would stuff it with straw, and then they would stuff it with cattle, wild animals, and people, and then they would burn it. Now the suggestion is that their preference was that they put in criminals, but if criminals weren't available, they would take other people. It's possible from some other suggestions, like some of the bog people that we found, you know, these almost perfectly preserved people that were found in bogs, that we know were sacrificed because they still have ropes around their neck and things of that sort. They don't show any sign of defensive wounds or no sign of struggle. And it's believed that some of those people may have voluntarily become sacrifices, because the idea was that if you died in sacrifice, you would come back, and in between you would have an opportunity to speak to the gods, which was considered a great honor. In fact, some of the early Roman reports were that before they sacrificed someone, the Druids would speak to the person about to be sacrificed and tell them what they should ask the gods when they see them. Well, the Wicker Man was one of the ways in which apparently they sacrificed people by burning. And there was actually sort of a cult favorite movie in 1975. It's a British cult horror movie called The Wicker Man. And it's about a detective coming to one of the islands around Scotland to try to investigate a disappearance. And he finds out, much to his permanent chagrin, toward the end of the movie, that what was happening is the people on that island were worshiping the ancient gods, and they were burning people in Wicker Man. By the way, Iceland has just recently, in the last couple of years, dedicated the first temple in 2 millennia to the Norse gods. So ancient paganism is very much making a rebound. There is some evidence as well that the ancient Celts, led by the Druids, may have eaten human flesh as part of religious ceremony, or in one case we have a record that it was considered and I quote, wholesome remedy to eat the flesh of particularly your enemies. So you can sort of see why this kind of thing died out. Not very popular or pleasant to us today. So this was the ancient religion. this whole topic, Druids, standing stones, and ancient pagans, I could go back 10,000 years because that's the oldest of some of the ruins that we have in terms of standing stones. I didn't. I only went back 2,000 to 3,000 years to talk about the Druids. I sort of jumped in the middle because it's hard to find one place you can latch onto this. I want to now talk a little bit about the older things and some of what you all have seen if you went to the Ring of Brodgar, or if you've ever been to Stonehenge in Wiltshire in England, then you will have experienced some of these kinds of standing stones. In some cases, they're in the form of rings. This is an image of what Stonehenge might have looked like when it was whole. I'm going to talk about Stonehenge in a minute. In some cases, we have these large stacked stones. There are all sorts of these things. These standing stones exist all over. In fact, they exist all over the world. We have examples of them in Asia as well. But nowhere are they as plentiful as they are throughout Britain. And throughout Britain means all of Britain. England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland. We find these kinds of monuments. Some of them do go back as far as 8,000 to 10,000 years. And we know that because in some cases, the stones, they've been able to examine the materials that are underneath them, fragments of wood or things that have been under these stones, and as long as the stones have been there, because when you've got a stone that weighs 30 or 40 tons, it's not likely that they moved it around much when they put it in place. And so they've been able to do carbon dating of some of the materials underneath some of these stones, and they've been able to identify as old as 8,000 years. Stonehenge, for instance, they have identified it to be somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago that they actually put the stones up, but they have identified material around it as being as much as 8,000 years old. Now, a hinge, by the way, Stonehenge, you have different forms of these things. There are stone circles, there are stone rows, that's obvious. A hinge is one in which it's more than just the standing stones, but where they have also done earthenworks. Those of you who went to the Ring of Brodgar, you noticed that there were humps and then ditches. That constitutes a hinge, where they also have done earthworks around it, so that they have something more than just the standing stones. There are many theories about what the standing stones were for. I asked our guide today, took her off to one side and said, "Why do you think they're here?" And she gave the answer I'm going to give you right now. We don't know. We do not know for sure why all of these extraordinary monuments. What it was, we not only don't know why, we don't know how in many cases. What it was that motivated Neolithic peoples, that is Stone Age people, the New Stone Age, to move these enormous stones and stand them upright in various configurations. There is some belief that it may have been creating an area for ritual ceremonies or funerals. In some cases, we have an indication that they were intended for astrological observations because of the way things line up. But even that's fairly difficult to say, because some of the ones that were built 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, for instance, the constellations, the stars, are not in the same place they were back then. The axis of the Earth has changed slightly over the millennia. The stars are moving. Remember, if you know the theory of the expanding universe, which they've been able to demonstrate, there is movement in the heavens. And so things that used to line up may not line up anymore. So in some cases, they only have to kind of guesstimate, where was this 3,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago when these were set up. But it's believed that in some cases, these are oriented to point toward the gaps in hills, the place where the sun would rise, or the moon would rise, or the Venus would rise, or various other kind of astrological cases. And in many cases, we know that that's at least one of the reasons they were there. There are different kinds of them. One, the single stones, and are called menhirs, which is a Gaelic word which means long stone. There are also agam stones, which are ones that have ancient carving on them. The oldest examples in Ireland that we have of Irish writing are these sort of slash and notch kinds of writings that are found on agam stones. And you'll see some examples of that when we get, I think, to the Isle of Man and also into Ireland as well, depending upon where you choose to visit. There is no indication that any of these sites, as far as I know, were dwellings. They didn't build this and then live inside them somehow. And usually, it's very rare for them to have found any burial sites there. Quite often, and that's the case at the Ring of Brodgar and some of the other places here that we've been seeing, they'll have burial mounds nearby, but not actually inside the stone circles. And that's one of the reasons they think they may have had various religious rituals and even funerals at the Circle of Stones, but then they buried the people outside that. That was not a place where they would bury them. Again, we have stone rows, we have stone circles. The largest stone circles, well, all the stone circles that we have example of are completely consistent in the way they're built, which is kind of weird because we have them in the Orkney Islands, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, but they're all consistent in that the largest stones form the main entrance into the circle or the hinge. The smallest stones will be directly across from that, and it will sort of digress from the highest stones down to the lower stones. And invariably, if we have any sort of directional constellation pointing or sun or whatever, it will be between the main opening and the smaller stones directly across from it. And that's completely consistent all the way along. Now, back in the 17th century, a man named John Aubrey, and this is before we knew hardly anything about these stones, but except that they were there, because obviously they've been around as long as anybody's been there to look at them in terms of Western culture. John Aubrey came up with the idea that the stone circles, like Stonehenge, would have been temples of the Druids. Well, on the surface, there's a real problem with that, because we now know that the Druids didn't get into the areas of Britain where these stones are most common, and we have at least 50,000 examples of standing stones in Britain alone, that is in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. 50,000 different examples. As you drive around the Orkneys, when you get to the Isle of Man, when you get to Isle of Mull, you'll be on our tour going down the highway, and the guy will say, well, you know, over there you see 2 standing stones. Oh, there's a standing stone. You know, there are a lot of them. And so John Aubrey and another fellow, Sir John Lubbock, in the next century, they suggested that these were built by the Druids as temples. Well, the problem is, if the Druids were the religious leaders of the Celts didn't get to Britain until somewhere around 500 BC. Their period in Britain of real influence was 500 BC up until as late perhaps as 500 AD, so about 1,000 years in there. Now, they'd existed in Europe a long time before that, but in terms of the British Isles. So since Stonehenge and some of these others were built 5,000 to 8,000 BC, or at least like the stones of Brodgar, 2,000 to 3,000 BC, and the Celts didn't get there until 500 BC, obviously we got a problem. Some people have thought, and I kind of leaned in this direction, that perhaps the Druids didn't come with the Celts. Perhaps the Druids were part of the Aboriginal British people, because we know there were people living in Britain before the Celts got here. The Celts came and became the dominant. But it may have been the Druid religion existed in Britain before the Celts got there, and they adopted it when they got there. We don't know for sure. There are a lot of questions about all of that. But we do know that there are a lot of megalithic buildings or monuments like this, not buildings, and that the Druids, whether they built them or not, we do know that they did practice ceremonies in them. So even if the Druids didn't come until 500 BC, and Stonehenge, for instance, was already there, it's almost certain that they then began to use it for ritual purposes. This, of course, is what Stonehenge looks like. And as I say, there's some belief that it may have been used by the Druids. In fact, there's a fairly general acknowledgement that they would have used it, but almost most people don't believe that they were responsible for building it, and that's the question that has come up. Stonehenge is extraordinary in the size of the stones. How many of you all have been to Stonehenge, that you've seen it? Okay. It is very impressive. Unfortunately, you can't actually get in among the stones anymore because this became so popular as a tourist attraction and as a ritual site for pseudo-druids, modern druids, we'll talk about in a minute, that they actually started doing a lot of damage. In 1 year, in the early 1900s, 2 of the stones were turned over by people, knocked over. So at that time it was privately owned, and the owner, first he put a fence around it and started charging admission, which everybody went crazy about, and then later on he sold it and the new owner gave it to the nation, and it's now owned as a public trust by England. So it is unlikely, unless the Druids were there first, that they built this thing. And the stones, if you've been there again, are on average 13 feet high. They're 6 feet 11 inches, just under 7 feet wide. Nearby, not inside, but nearby, we do have several hundred different burial mounds. So there was a lot of burial going on at that time. As I told you, radiocarbon dating has demonstrated that there was something going on there as long ago as 8,000 BC, but they believe the stones were actually put up somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 BC. And again, we don't know who built it. We don't know for sure why they built it. We do know that it probably had something to do in terms of its use with the pagan religion of the Druids. And in the 20th century, Stonehenge has become kind of a symbol for the revival of the new pagan religious movement. Again, I'm going to show you some pictures in a minute, so everybody grab your butts, because there's some weird pictures. Here are examples of stone circles or stone rows. Again, menhirs, which mean long stones in the Brittonic languages. They're sometimes called standing stones, orthostats, liths. There are a lot of different names for them. Most of them are shaped in sort of a rectangular shape, in terms of they'll be wider than thick, and tend to taper toward the top. But usually that's not because they were cut that way, that's because that's the way the stone naturally happened. Those of you who were at Brodgar, you saw that some of the stones had broken, and you could tell by looking at the stones that the stone itself, if they're sandstone or certain kinds of stones, there's a natural tendency to sort of split and fall apart, and so the tops tend to be sharpened, just generally speaking. And the various formations, the monuments of the menhirs can be any number of shapes. One stone, two stones, a circle of stones, a horseshoe of stones, an ellipse of stones. There's all sorts of things. And again, we don't know exactly why. The largest surviving menhir or standing stone in the world is located in Brittany in France, and it has fallen over now. In fact, it's called the Grand Menhir Brisé, meaning the great broken menhir. At one point, well, it's still this long, but when it stood upright, it would have been 68 feet tall. When it fell, it broke into 4 pieces. When it was all in one piece, it would have weighed just over 330 tons. And that's only the third biggest or heaviest stone that we know of that was moved by people before they had automated machinery, before they had mechanics. There was a stone the heaviest stone we know of is called the Thunderstone in St. Petersburg, and then the Western Stone in the Western Wall. Both are heavier than 330 tons, and we don't know how they moved them. We still don't know. How did they build the pyramids? There are all sorts of questions about ancient mechanics and how they did things. Another thing that you will find as you travel through Britain, and this is especially true in the western side of Ireland, but in other places too, are these sorts of structures called dolmens. These are burial places. Ordinarily, they would be a burial, and there would be standing stones from 2 to 4 or even more standing stones that would then hold up a capstone or table that would go on top of it. This one in the lower right is called Palma Broom, and it's one of the most famous sites in terms of Neolithic sites in Ireland. The Palma Broom, the top piece, the uprights are more than 6 feet tall. The top piece is over 12 feet long. How did they get that up there? We still do not know. Usually, because these were burial sites, the capstone or table would be at an angle, as though suggesting that there was a direction toward heaven, perhaps for the spirit to find its way into the heavens. Usually, when they would build something like this, they would then fill it in with stones or dirt so that it ended up being a mound called a tumulus. But then over a period of time, rain and wind, general erosion, would cause all of that dirt and small stones to fall away, and we would have what's in effect the skeleton of the dolmen, which is what you see there. The oldest dolmens we know in Western Europe are about 7,000 years old. So they have been doing this for a very long time. Again, the Druids and the Celtic people, we believe these had to do with their religious practice and their religion. To give you a little more detail about it, these images, the upper left image is a Celtic example of the antlered god Cernunnos. On the right-hand side, this too is a Celtic image. This is Epona, the goddess of horses and riding. And this beautiful tapestry down here, is one version, one image of the Tuatha De Danann. I'm going to tell you what that means in a minute. The Stone Age and Iron Age people practiced a kind of paganism, a polytheism, that was, as I said before, quite sophisticated. It was the thing that held the Celtic people together. It was the most common aspect of it. And they had many, many different named gods. And one of the most powerful of their gods was said to be both creator, preserver, and destroyer. And that sort of trinity, I'm going to talk about this when I talk about how the Irish saved civilization. It's believed that one of the ways in which St. Patrick was so successful in teaching the Irish about the Trinity of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is that their religion was full of trinities. They saw things in threes. And so he was successful in teaching them that. Again, this one down here, one of the favorite gods of the ancient Celtic people was a god named Danu, a goddess, a female god, who was seen as the goddess of comfort and of family, and that's why she was one of the most favorite. It's believed that she was the mother of most of the supernatural races later on. Why does Ireland, and this is Tuatha De Danann, is particularly Irish, why is it that Ireland is so famous for supernatural creatures, leprechauns and fairies and, all kinds of things? Well, it's believed that all of those, as well as the great heroes and the lesser gods in Irish history, were all the children of Danu, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And so Tuatha De Danann means the children of Danu. And it's believed that there's a connection between all of those other spiritual beings. And when people started coming into the land in greater numbers, the Tuatha De Danann didn't want to associate with them, and so they moved to an other world, a different place that is found underneath the hills, underneath the mountains in Ireland. And so they can interact with humans and with the human world, but they live somewhere else now. And that's the leprechauns, the fairies, and fairies aren't little tiny Tinkerbell creatures. Fairies in Ireland are very powerful. I read a quote not too long ago, a character in a book who was Irish, and they said, well, aren't you Christian? And his response was, I believe in the Father, and in the Son, and in the Holy Spirit, and in the she who rides on the winds. The she is the banshee, that would have been one of the Tuatha De Danann, the one who comes and announces the coming of death and that sort of thing. They were the kings and queens, the heroes, the lesser gods, the spiritual beings. Now, I told you I had at least one scary image for you, and that has to do with the neo-pagan movement. There has been a massive move recently, and Iceland is one of the places this has happened most, although they seem a little bit more sensible about it than some of the other places. There has been a neo-pagan, neo-druidic movement. They call it Druidry in modern times. They have done all they can to try to reproduce the Druid beliefs, but of course, we don't know a lot about the Druid beliefs. And when I said it's scary, this fellow, this left-hand side, can you see him? He is tattooed completely. He has a stud in his forehead. His eyes are, I don't know if he's wearing contacts or whatever, they look sort of blackened over, and he has a forked tongue. You wonder if he ever wakes up in the morning and looks in the mirror and says, what the heck have I done? Because I don't think you come back from that. Anyway, you get the various people, and this is Stonehenge in the background, because every year, especially on the summer solstice, they will practice ceremonies. They will get permits to have events at Stonehenge. It's the most popular, although they do it at other places as well. And in fact, there have been a couple of different models of Stonehenge that have been built in other parts of the world so that pagans can have someplace closer to home that they can recognize this stuff. It's a form of spirituality or religion, and some of the most vehement Druids insist it is a religion, and that you cannot actually be Muslim, Jewish, Christian, and a Druid. That it is a faith that is particular and exclusive as other religions are. They especially focus on being in harmony with nature. They worship aspects of nature. So a lot of the Druids are very involved in the ecology movements and in the natural world. This all began in Britain in the 18th century, and they developed societies of Druids that's most of them have died out, some have continued, others have come up. But this veneration, respect for nature is a big part of it. I'll give you a quote related to the religion part of it. This is Katha Tiernan, who is one of the leaders of the modern Druid movement, says this: contrary to wrong beliefs, Druids have been and still are religious, not only believing in, but also knowing that reincarnation is real. Furthermore, Druids know there are many gods and goddesses. One cannot be a Christian, Wiccan, Muslim, or anything else and a Druid. They will contradict each other. So some of these people probably just do this as a lark. It's like cosplay, right? Instead of dressing up like Thor, you dress up like, but for many of these people, this has become religion. And as I say, there is a new temple in Iceland to the Norse gods. They are picking up the ancient paganism. Not Druidry so much, but the Norse gods. And so this is, I think it's an effort to recapture something they feel has been lost. But questions about Druids, standing stones, Celts, ancient religions? What questions do you have? Stunned. Yes?
Why do you stones are in Great Britain and UK?
Why do I think that most of the stones are in Great Britain and UK? This is one of the things that leads me to think that maybe the Druids were part of what's called the Aboriginal British people and didn't come over with the Celts, because we find them there in the area where Druidry was the primary religion, where the Celts had lived. Anglo-Saxons came in later, but they're long before the Anglo-Saxons. And so it appears that whatever the people groups were there, whether they were the Druids were the Aboriginal people or not, this was part of their belief system. And that's really all we can say, because we don't know what in their belief system prompted them to want to set up these stones. I mean, there are cases like Stonehenge, for instance, where the kind of bluestone they have had to have been quarried huge distances away, transported over land, shipped up rivers, pulled over, low mountains. It's just astonishing that not only that they could do it, but why? What would be the motivation to do this unbelievable thing? And some of these things probably took hundreds of years to create, because you don't just do this overnight. And so what was it that as a community of people, they were so motivated? See, the large examples of standing stones, especially circles and that sort of thing, hinges, it would have to be a whole community that was committed to doing this. It's not like one family could say, hey, I'm going to build Stonehenge, right? So what was it about their belief system as a people, as a community, that would lead them to commit, many, many generations of their community to do these sorts of things? We simply don't know. But whatever it was, it had to do with the people that were living in that area more than others. Other questions? Yes?
You mentioned Wicca. How would you differentiate Druid from?
How would I differentiate Druidry from Wicca? For those of you who don't know, Wicca is the modern version. It's witchcraft. I mean, Wiccans are those who believe in. Now, they would insist that it's white magic, not black magic, and they're very clear about that. I was in a church once, and they had a notice on the board for a meeting of the local Wiccan chapter, and I thought, well, that's an interesting thing to find on the church bulletin board. Wicca is not as focused on nature, I don't think, as the Druids were. But the primary difference, I would say, is that the Druidry tries to link itself back to a specific past group of people that did practice some divination, some sort of supernatural arts, whereas the Wicca is much more broad than that. It's not linked just to the Celtic people or the Druids, etc. So it's probably a historical linking difference would be the greatest difference. There are a lot of things that would be in common. The desire to recognize the power of nature, to try to access supernatural abilities in some ways, but I think it's probably historically would be the biggest difference. Other questions? It's kind of hard to ask questions when what we've just said is that most of this we have no idea about, right? And I fully understand that. We know it's there. We know these people existed. We can only surmise from what little archaeological evidence we have why these things might have been. But they are fascinating. And someday we may have a discovery. I mean, those of you who went today to Scala Brae, it wasn't until a bad storm washed away some of the soil and things that they discovered that there was an extraordinary ancient Neolithic series of houses there, a community. And so, who knows what we may find in the future? We may have more information. Yes, Amity.
How do we know what we do know?
How do we know what we do know? Well, I'm a strong believer that at least 2/3 of what we think we know, we don't really know. I mean, I gave a talk on the Loch Ness Monster, for heaven's sake, right? So, no, I think that we always have to have some humility about it. But we also have to be sensible in terms of saying, here's what the evidence is telling us. If we didn't believe that, we'd never have law courts or anything else. So I think that as long as we're willing to say, this is how much we do know, and here's what we don't know, we may find out more later. I think that's the best we can do, you know.
But what is the source of that knowledge other than the archaeology, for example, the belief?
Right. The parts about the belief that we have are either from some of the early Latin writers, Julius Caesar, Tacitus, I mentioned Cicero or Cicero. They wrote about some of the beliefs of the Druids, not in a positive way. You know, they thought they were crazy. I mean, you know, these are barbarians. Even they worship completely different gods than the gods we worship. But then we also have the stories and legends from the Irish and Welsh, especially. For instance, the Tuatha De Danann that I mentioned. There are extensive stories about that in the Irish histories, in the Irish stories, the poems. We have a lot of references to those things. And when I talk about how the Irish saved civilization, one of the reasons we have that material now is because the Irish monks, when the monasteries were formed in Ireland, they copied books, and they didn't only copy religious books. They copied Greek history and culture and philosophy and commentary and theater and Latin. And they copied the old Irish stories in the Gaelic language, even though it had to do with gods that they didn't believe in anymore. So we have that preserved because of the Christian monasteries in Ireland, and we do know that the old legends and stories talk about the beliefs that they had, and that's where most of that evidence comes from. But it's not, you know, we don't have it as a history, we have it as a story. Okay? Anything else? Yes?
In consideration of where we're located right now, was it a clash of cultures when the Vikings came here then? They had their own mythology. How did it modify the Druids, or was it a whole different period of time?
Well, so the question is, when the Vikings came, was there a conflict of cultures because they had their own pantheon, their own belief system, the old Norse beliefs, the Norse gods, you know, Odin and Thor and all that. It wasn't really a religious conflict because the Vikings, like the Druids and others, were, and by the way, by the time the Vikings got down here, a lot of the Druid stuff had already been done away with by the Romans and Anglo-Saxons, all right? But like the Vikings coming down, the Vikings were polytheists, just like the Romans were. And the Romans, if you've ever studied like the Roman and Greek religions, they each had their own pantheon. And yet they saw them as the same. And the Romans, when they conquered a new area and they said, well, our God is blah, blah, the God of the mountain, they go, okay, that's cool, we'll add another God. So because they were polytheistic, they were always willing to be syncretistic. They would bring other gods in. The Vikings were the same way. They were very happy, and this is one of the reasons that the Vikings, without too much problem later on, became Christians. Just that's why the barbarians, many of them became Christians, is because they didn't have a problem with believing that this new place we've come to has a different God, and maybe we need to accept that God and even worship him. And in some cases, when they converted to Christianity, the only real problem they had, and this is what the Druids had a problem with Christianity, is that Christianity was fairly unique, and it said that there was only one God. and the rest of this is false. Most of the other religions would say, sure, we'll add another god. I don't have a problem with that. And that's where the conflict came between the monotheistic religion and the polytheistic religions. I'll tell you a story later on. In fact, I'm going to tell you a story right now, and I'll refer back to it later. The Viking Rollo, who was responsible for bringing his Viking ships down and taking over the area that became known as Normandy in France. Normandy means land of the Northmen, and there were Vikings settled there. I'll tell you why later. But Rollo, one of the ways he was given the land and given title by the King of France, actually the King of the Franks at that point, was because he agreed to convert to Christianity. He didn't have a big problem with that. And so he converted to Christianity, and he ended up supporting monasteries and churches. He built the church in Rouen and other major... So when he was on his deathbed, he said, okay, when I die, I want two things. I want to be buried in the cathedral in Rouen that I built, paid for, in other words, and I want to have a huge service in my memory, and I also want a human sacrifice, so that when I get to the other side, whether it's the Christian God or Odin, I know I'm covered. That was how a lot of, they did that. They were willing to accept other gods, but that didn't mean they necessarily agreed to give up what they had. I'm getting into all sorts of things here. Other questions? Yes? Right. The question is, do we, if we know that Stonehenge has some astronomical or astrological both significance in terms of how it lines up with sun, moon, etc. But what about the others? Yes, there is strong evidence that the others do as well. When we talk about the history of Ireland, one of the first images I'll show you is a place called Newgrange, which is in Ireland, not too far from Dublin, and it's this mound. It's stone walls and a mound. It looks like a brand new construction now. It's unbelievable. And it was a burial mound, and it covers more than an acre, and there's a tunnel that goes through it. And on the summer solstice, on the winter solstice, that is the morning after the shortest day of the year, the rising sun shines through a hole about the size of a shoebox and brings light to the whole length of a hallway that they have that goes deep into this to the burial chamber in the center. And it was so specifically made, and the idea being that by bringing the light in after the longest night of the year, it was an assurance that the light would continue to come, and that it wasn't all ending now and they were all going to be fine. So we have many, many examples besides Stonehenge where there was clearly an astrological association: the sun, the moon, constellations, etc. Any other questions? Yes.
We've been to Newgrange, and that is very impressive. That tunnel with the light. These people were farmers, weren't they? So that would be very important for them to know for planting seeds and everything when the shortest day of the year occurred.
Right. So the question or comment is that since they were farmers, it would be very important for them to know, the almanacs. You should get the farmer's almanac, and they would have a lot about when is the full moon, what are the tides, everything else, because of planting seasons. And so, yes, that would have been important to them. But the people in their culture that were responsible for keeping track of that, the average farmer would not have had the time. We have leisure time to have all sorts of hobbies. They would not have had the time, given the workload they had, to have maintained a study of astronomy or of the seasons. The religious leaders, that was their job. And the Druids were the ones that did that for the Celts. They maintained that study and that knowledge and that understanding, and then made it available to the people in the community, and that's one of the reasons they were valued. So yes, that would have been important to the farming culture, the agricultural stuff, but not everybody would have been involved in that. Okay, one more. Yes?
Didn't the Incas move big stones like that and have also astronomical studies?
Yes, didn't the Incas? Well, the Incas did, the Aztecs did. We have the Aztec calendar, which is considered extraordinarily accurate. We have had ancient cultures all over the planet that have both moved huge stones. There are pyramids in South America, in Mexico where we live. In fact, there are bigger pyramids in terms of total volume, not in height, but in total volume than the pyramids of Giza, because they're wider. So yes, there are many ancient cultures that did extraordinary things, which is another reason, as I've said before, I think we need to have some humility about stuff. Thank you all very much. Have a great evening and a great tomorrow.